Middle 2, Reproduction in Plants, Part 2. We've been talking about the structure of the flower, and then we have to talk about how do we know the sex or the gender of the flower. The flower can be one of three things. If the flower has both the male parts, which is the androecium, which is the sepals, and the female part, which is the gynosium, we call this a hermaphrodite flower. A hermaphrodite flower is a flower that is a male and a female in the same time, and this only can happen in the plant world. All right, then we have a flower that is male only. The flower that is male only have the male part, which we said before is the androecium, so this is a male flower. And of course, if we doesn't have the male parts and we only have the female part, the gynosium, so the flower will be a female flower. So a flower can be male flower, which have the male parts only, female flower, which have the female parts only, and hermaphrodite or bisexual flower, and that means it has both male and female parts in the same time. The plant can reproduce by one of two ways: sexual reproduction and asexual reproduction. Asexual reproduction is a type of reproduction that doesn't concerned with presence of male or female. It doesn't have a male or female. The parts of the plant just reproduce by their own self. And we'll talk about this type later. We will now talk about the sexual reproduction, the reproduction that has the flower in it, the reproduction that is concerned with the reproduction which have two types of individuals, male and female. So if we talk about presence of male and female parts, we're talking about sexual reproduction. And the sexual reproduction in the plant take part in two main steps. These two main steps are: number one, pollination, and number two is called fertilization. Let's talk about pollination first. Pollination is a transfer. So pollination is a transfer. Who transfers? The pollen grains. From where to where? From anther, the male part of a plant, to stigma, the female part of the plant. The pollination, how do they transfer? They transfer by wind, by water, by insects, or by man. And we will talk about these parts of transfer later. The pollination may be self-pollination in the same tree or the same flower. We've been talking about the hermaphrodite flower, which has male and female parts. So its male part can send a pollen grain to its female part. So this is called a self-pollination, or can send a pollen grain to the next flower in the same tree. It's also called a self-pollination. And it might be mixed pollination, where the pollen grains transfer from one tree to another tree. All right, so the pollination can take part by wind. And when it takes part by wind, by air or by wind, there are criteria that have to be found in the flower. Pollen grains is carried from another stigma by wind. These flowers are characterized by anthers are hanging outside the flower, and they can be easily open. The stigma are feathery and sticky to catch pollen grains from the air, and the pollen grain, of course, had to be very light, so they can be carried by the air. And if it's carried by the air, it can be lost in the way. So they are produced in large number of pollen grains to compensate for what's lost in the air. The pollen grains are light in weight and dry to be easily carried by the air. If the pollination will take part by the insect, we said before that the corolla is colored and scented to attract the insects to go to the flower. The pollen grains, petals are colored and scented. The pollen grains are sticky, so they stick to the legs of the bee or the insect. Or they have rough surface for the same reason, to stick in the leg of the bee. There are also something called artificial pollination, which is man-made pollination, and this happens in some kinds of plant, like the palm trees, where the pollen grains are very heavy. And if a farmer needs a big crop, he wouldn't wait for the nature to pollinate his palm trees. So there are a worker who goes up to the male tree, gets the pollen grain, and goes up to the female tree, put them in the flower of the female tree. All right. Then we talked about the first step of the sexual reproduction, which is pollination or transfer of pollen grain. Then we have the second step, which is fertilization. We haven't said before that the pollen grain and the ovum, the male cell and the female cell, each of them have half the number of the genetic material or of the chromosomes. So the fertilization is the fusion or mixing of female pollen grain, which have half the number of chromosomes, and the male pollen grain, the male pollen grain, which have half the number of chromosomes, and the female ovum, which have other half of the chromosome or half number of chromosome, to form the zygote, which have a full number of chromosome and which is the first cell of the new living organism.